My name is Susan Hale. I'm in my early 40s, and for most of my life, I've been described as easy to be with. The calm one, the reasonable one, the woman who doesn't make scenes and doesn't ask for much. I work in operations management, a role that rewards precision and patience, and for many years I was also a wife who believed that steadiness was a form of love. People tend to underestimate me, but never loudly. It's subtle. They assume I'll adapt, that I'll wait, that if something is slightly off, I'll smooth it over without comment. I don't raise my voice. I don't demand attention. And because of that, people often mistake my composure for absence, as if I'm not fully there, as if my silence means consent. This story isn't about a single betrayal or a dramatic revelation. It's about how disrespect becomes obvious in small moments. Moments so small they're easy to excuse. A pause that lasts too long. A reply that doesn't come. A phone that matters more than the person sitting across the table. Nothing explosive. Nothing you could easily point to and say, that's when it ended. The night at the center of this story was our anniversary dinner. Not a milestone one, no grand number attached to it, but meaningful to me all the same. We had a reservation, we dressed up, we sat down across from each other, and almost immediately my husband began checking his phone, again and again, during the entire dinner, not urgently, not apologetically, just casually, as if my presence required no explanation. I didn't confront him, I didn't ask him to put it away. I finished my meal. When the check arrived, I paid the bill myself, stood up, and walked out. That action might sound dramatic when summarized in a sentence, but the truth is, it was quiet, almost gentle, and it only carried weight because of everything that had happened before it. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how someone slowly recognizes that they've been downgraded in their own relationship, not through cruelty, but through indifference. This is not a story of revenge. There is no shouting, no humiliation, no sudden power grab. It's a documentary-style reflection on what happens when clarity arrives and you stop negotiating with yourself. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, because I stayed longer than I should have. I noticed things earlier than I admitted, and when I finally moved, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of alignment. I didn't want to win. I wanted to stop disappearing. If you're listening because you've ever felt invisible in a place where you were supposed to be cherished, this story is for you. Not as a lesson, and not as a warning, but as proof that quiet decisions can still be final. Let me ask you something gently before we begin. Have you ever realized that nothing dramatic happened, yet you knew, without doubt, that something was already over? For a long time, I believed I knew exactly who I was to the people around me. I was the reliable one, the steady presence, the person who made things easier without asking to be thanked for it. In my marriage especially, I occupied a role that was never formally assigned, yet consistently expected. The woman who would adjust. To my husband, I was efficient. I handled logistics, remembered appointments, and paid bills on time. I made sure birthdays didn't pass unnoticed, that groceries appeared in the fridge, that life continued smoothly. He used to say, "I don't know how you keep everything together," and I took that as affection. I didn't realize at the time that admiration can quietly turn into dependency, and dependency, if left unchecked, can turn into disregard. Among friends and family, I was seen as composed, low maintenance, the one who didn't need much reassurance. If plans changed at the last minute, I shrugged it off. If someone spoke over me, I waited for a pause that rarely came. I told myself it didn't matter. That being flexible was maturity. That emotional self-sufficiency was a strength. What I didn't notice, at least not consciously, was how my presence became optional. Not unwanted, just non-essential. At dinners, conversations flowed around me. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, my comments were often acknowledged with a nod, then gently overridden by something louder, more urgent. I smiled. I adapted. I told myself I preferred observing anyway. But observation without participation eventually starts to feel like exile. In my marriage, this dynamic settled in slowly. At first, it looked like trust. He didn't check in because he assumed I was fine. He didn't ask my opinion because he assumed I agreed. Decisions were made quickly, efficiently, often without me, but never, he would say, against me. And I accepted that logic for far too long. I told myself love didn't need constant validation, that comfort was a sign of security, that not being fussed over was evidence of respect. These were all reasonable explanations. That's what made them dangerous. There was no cruelty, no insults, no obvious betrayal, just a growing sense that my emotional presence wasn't required for the relationship to function. I was part of the infrastructure, important but unnoticed, unless something went wrong. I became very good at not needing. I learned to anticipate moods, to time conversations carefully, to phrase concerns in ways that wouldn't disrupt the atmosphere. I would wait until he seemed relaxed, until he wasn't distracted, until it felt safe to speak. And more often than not, that moment never arrived. Over time, I stopped trying. From the outside, we looked stable, calm. People envied our lack of drama. "You two are so solid," they'd say. And I'd smile because solidity sounds like success. But solidity without tenderness is just weight. The truth is, I trained everyone, including my husband, on how little attention I required. I rewarded inconsistency with patience. I absorbed neglect quietly and labeled it understanding. I thought I was being generous. I didn't realize I was erasing myself. I wasn't unhappy all the time. That's important to say. There were good days. Laughter, familiar routines. But there was also a constant low-level loneliness that followed me even when I wasn't alone. A feeling that I could disappear from the room and nothing essential would shift. And perhaps the hardest part was this. No one meant to hurt me, which made it difficult to justify feeling hurt at all. When you are treated as invisible in gentle ways, you begin to question your right to object. You wonder if you're being too sensitive, too demanding. You remind yourself of all the things that are technically fine, and you stay. For a long time, I stayed. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it linger now. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no sharp words, just a small, almost invisible shift that registered somewhere deep in my body before my mind could explain it away. We were at a friend's birthday dinner, one of those crowded, noisy gatherings where conversation overlaps and attention drifts easily. I was sitting next to my husband, angled slightly toward him, the way you do when you expect to be included. I was telling a story. Nothing profound. Just something that had happened at work that week. I remember because I had debated whether to share it at all. Halfway through my sentence, his phone buzzed. He didn't apologize. He didn't glance at me with just a second look. He simply picked up the phone and started scrolling, thumb moving, eyes locked. My voice trailed off on its own, like it had hit a wall. No one reacted. The table was loud. Someone else jumped in with a different story. Laughter rolled on. My unfinished sentence dissolved into the background noise. I sat there, fork paused midair, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter, like a small door closing. A few minutes later, he put the phone down and rejoined the conversation as if nothing had happened. He leaned over and asked, "What were you saying again?" The question was casual, almost kind, and I smiled and said, "Oh, it was nothing." That was the cut. Not the phone, not the interruption. It was the way I erased myself so quickly, the way it felt easier to minimize my own words than to ask him to care enough to hear them. On the drive home, he was in a good mood. He talked about the food, the people, and how late it had gotten. I nodded, responded at the right moments. I didn't bring it up. It felt too small to mention, too petty. I told myself I was overreacting, but my body remembered. After that night, I started noticing similar moments. Not all at once, just flickers. A glance at his phone when I was mid-thought. A delayed response to something I'd said, followed by a change of subject. A conversation resumed without me, as I'd never entered it. Each time I made excuses. He's busy, he's stressed, he didn't mean it. And maybe all of that was true. but intent doesn't erase impact, and impact accumulates, whether you acknowledge it or not. What made it harder was that no one else seemed to notice. Friends continued to see us as a unit, a stable couple. When my husband spoke, people listened. When I went quiet, it was interpreted as my natural state. I began to question myself. Was I expecting too much? Did I really need that level of attention? Wasn't it normal for couples to drift in and out of focus? So I adjusted. I shortened my stories. I waited until he wasn't looking at his phone before speaking. I learned to pause if his attention wavered, then resume when it returned, like buffering. And every time I did that, something inside me learned a new rule. Your words are conditional. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar immediately, but it changed the way I moved through the relationship. I became more careful, more observant, less spontaneous. I started measuring when it was worth speaking and when it was safer to stay quiet. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even myself, not honestly. I filed it away as a misunderstanding, a minor thing. A moment is not worth disrupting the larger picture. But somewhere deep down I knew, once you notice being set aside, you can't fully unsee it. And that awareness, once it arrives, doesn't leave. It waits. Once you accept the first small cut, the rest don't feel like injuries anymore. They feel like habits, patterns, things you learn to work around rather than confront. That's how it happened for me. What began as occasional distractions slowly became routine. My husband checked his phone while I spoke. During meals, during conversations that mattered to me, even during moments that, on paper, were supposed to be shared. At first, I'd pause, waiting for his attention to return. Then I'd continue. Later, I stopped pausing altogether. I'd simply keep talking, even if I wasn't sure he was listening. And eventually, I stopped talking. I told myself it was maturity. Those relationships didn't need constant engagement to be real. That comfort meant not having to pay attention all the time. These explanations sounded reasonable, even enlightened. They were easy to believe because they required nothing from him and silence from me. I learned to fill the gaps internally. If he seemed distracted, I'd assume it wasn't about me. If he forgot something I'd mentioned, I'd remind him gently, or not at all. I stopped expecting follow-up questions, stopped waiting for reactions. I started pre-editing my thoughts before sharing them, asking myself, is this worth interrupting his focus? That question became automatic. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, disguised as normalcy. No one around us saw anything wrong because nothing looked wrong. There were no arguments, no cold shoulders. We functioned well, efficiently. I cooked. He thanked me. I handled finances. He trusted me. We shared responsibilities without conflict. On the surface, it looked like a balance, but underneath, the emotional exchange had become one-directional. I was present. He was adjacent. What made it especially difficult was that I participated in this normalization. Every time I chose not to speak up, I reinforced the pattern. Every time I smiled, through being overlooked, I taught him, and everyone else, that this was acceptable. That was me. There were moments when I almost said something. Small openings, like when he'd say, "Sorry, what did you say?" after missing half of a conversation, or when he'd respond to something I'd said minutes earlier, clearly having just processed it. Those moments hovered, inviting honesty. But honesty felt risky. It felt like I'd be introducing conflict where none officially existed, and I had built my identity on being the calm one, the reasonable one, the woman who didn't need to make a point. So I rationalized. I told myself love didn't always look attentive. People show care in different ways. That I was being too focused on something minor. But minor things repeated shape reality. I began to feel strangely alone even when we were together. Sitting next to him on the couch, each of us looking at our own screens, I told myself this was modern life. That closeness didn't require constant interaction. Yet there was a hollow feeling that accompanied those moments. A sense that I was nearby, but not with him. I noticed it most when I stopped sharing my inner world. I no longer talked about my frustrations, my small victories, and my thoughts at the end of the day. Not because he shut me down explicitly, but because the effort no longer felt worth it. I didn't want to compete with a screen. I didn't want to repeat myself. Silence became easier, and with that silence came a subtle shift in power. When one person consistently yields attention, they become the background. They become the one who waits. And waiting, over time, changes how you see yourself. I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace that requires self-erasure isn't peace. It's a resignation. Still, I stayed. I adapted. I normalized what shouldn't have been normal. Because admitting something was wrong would have meant admitting I'd allowed it to happen. And that truth was harder to face than the quiet discomfort of being unseen. So I kept going, calm, functional, invisible, until the role I was playing became impossible to ignore. It didn't happen in a single moment of realization. There was no sentence, no argument, no clear event where I suddenly understood the role I'd been placed in. It arrived gradually, like a label you don't notice until it's already stuck. I was the reliable one, the emotional constant, the person who could be counted on to remain steady regardless of circumstances. That role sounds flattering until you realize how limiting it is. Reliability, when taken for granted, becomes an expectation. An expectation, when unexamined, becomes entitlement. In my marriage, my role was to absorb, to adjust, to make things easier by not requiring much. I wasn't asked what I needed because it was assumed I didn't need anything. I wasn't checked on because I never seemed unsettled. And over time, my emotional presence became something optional rather than essential. I began to notice how decisions were made. Not maliciously, but efficiently. Weekend plans discussed in passing, already half decided. Social commitments were agreed to before I was consulted. Financial choices are framed as conclusions rather than conversations. If I hesitated, I was reassured. If I questioned, I was told it wasn't a big deal, and I let it go again and again. Because the role I had been assigned wasn't just something others imposed, it was something I maintained. I had become the woman who didn't complicate things, who didn't push back, who didn't need to be centered. There's a quiet reward system in relationships like this. You're praised for being easy, for being understanding, for not making demands. And those compliments feel good until you realize they're conditional. You're valued as long as you remain low impact. I saw it in subtle ways. When I did speak up, the room shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. Conversation slowed, faces tightened just slightly, as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement. I was no longer playing my part correctly. So I learned when to speak and when to stay silent. I became skilled at reading the temperature of the room. I waited for moments when my input wouldn't disrupt the flow. And when those moments didn't come, I told myself it was fine. But inside, something was hardening. I wasn't angry. I was becoming detached. There's a difference. Anger seeks change. Detachment prepares for exit. I started seeing myself the way others seemed to see me. Useful, stable, background. I was the infrastructure of the relationship, not its center. Important, yes, but only in the way plumbing is important. You notice it when it fails. That realization was painful, not because it made me feel small, but because it made me feel replaceable. Not as a person, but as a role. Anyone could have done what I was doing, as long as they stayed quiet and capable. And that's when I understood something unsettling. I had been mistaken for a function, not a partner. The role was clear now. I was there to support, to smooth, to sustain. Not to be deeply engaged with. Not to be prioritized. Not to be listened to when something else demanded attention. Once you see the role, you can't unsee it. You begin to recognize how often you're performing rather than participating. How much of your energy goes into maintaining equilibrium instead of experiencing connection? I didn't confront him, not yet. Confrontation would have required me to step out of the role publicly, and at that point, I wasn't ready to do that. But internally, the shift had begun. I stopped trying to earn attention. I stopped filling the silence. I stopped compensating for absence. And in that quiet withdrawal, I started to understand that the role I'd been assigned only existed because I kept showing up for it. And if I stopped, really stopped, the entire structure would have to change. That thought stayed with me. The day something shifted wasn't marked by conflict. There was no argument, no raised voice, no final straw that snapped loudly in two. It was ordinary, quiet, almost forgettable, except for what changed inside me. It was a weekday evening. We were both home. the house settled into its familiar rhythm. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling on his phone, the television murmuring in the background. I was at the kitchen counter, sorting through mail. Bills, ads, nothing urgent. The kind of domestic moment that blends into all the others. I said something simple, a passing comment about my day, not a complaint, not a request, just an offering. He didn't respond. At first I assumed he hadn't heard me, so I waited. A few seconds passed, then more. His eyes never left the screen. His thumb kept moving, and in that pause something happened. I felt clear, not hurt, not angry, clear. For the first time, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't repeat myself. I didn't adjust my tone, or step closer, or try to re-enter his attention. I just stood there, holding the mail, and noticed what was happening without trying to fix it. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a bad moment. It was information. I watched myself from a distance, as if I were observing someone else. A woman offering connection. A man choosing distraction. No villain, no drama, just a choice being made, and not by me. And for the first time, I didn't interpret that choice as a reflection of my worth. I saw it as a reflection of priority. That distinction changed everything. I realized I had been spending years translating his inattention into my inadequacy. If he didn't listen, I must not be interesting enough. If he didn't engage, I must be asking at the wrong time. If he didn't notice, I must be too quiet. Standing there in the kitchen, I understood how backwards that was. I wasn't failing to be heard. I was being deprioritized. And the moment that truth settled, something inside me disengaged. Not from him, but from the struggle. The constant internal effort to adjust, accommodate, and explain dissolved. I felt an unexpected calm, like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. He eventually looked up, said my name, asked, "What?" I answered evenly, repeated my sentence. He nodded, returned to his phone, and that was it. No confrontation, no emotional surge, just confirmation. The shift wasn't about him changing. It was about me stopping the internal negotiation. I no longer wondered if I was being unreasonable. I no longer searched for better timing. I no longer framed my needs as inconveniences. I saw the relationship clearly for the first time. Not as it could be, not as it once was, but as it currently existed. And clarity is irreversible. From that day on, my silence changed texture. Before it had been a reaction, a retreat. Now it was a choice. I stopped offering parts of myself where they weren't being received. I conserved my energy. I observed without emotional urgency. He didn't notice the shift right away. Why would he? I had always been quiet. The difference was internal. But internally, I was no longer waiting. I was no longer hoping. I was no longer adjusting my expectations to avoid disappointment. I began asking myself different questions. Not how can I make this work, but what am I accepting? Not is this normal, but is this enough for me? Those questions didn't demand immediate answers. They simply existed, steady and present, guiding my attention elsewhere. That night, as we went to bed, nothing looked different. The house was the same. The routines are intact. But something fundamental had shifted. I had stopped interpreting neglect as something to endure. I had started seeing it as a signal. And once you hear a signal clearly, you can't pretend it's noise. After that evening, my silence was no longer accidental. It wasn't the result of hesitation or self-doubt. It became intentional, measured even. I didn't announce it. I didn't frame it as a boundary. I simply stopped offering myself where there was no space to receive me. Outwardly, very little changed. I still participated in daily routines. I still responded when spoken to. I still handled responsibilities with the same competence. That's why no one noticed. To an outside observer, I was the same woman I had always been. Calm, capable, unproblematic. But internally, I had shifted from emotional labor to emotional conservation. I no longer filled the silence to ease discomfort. If he didn't respond, I didn't rush to bridge the gap. If a conversation stalled, I let it end. I stopped rephrasing my thoughts in the hope they'd land better. I stopped monitoring his attention as a cue for whether I was allowed to speak. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't passive aggression. It was alignment. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It's a form of clarity. At first, my husband didn't register the difference. He was used to my quiet presence, used to me adapting. My withdrawal didn't disrupt his routine, because the routine had never depended on my emotional engagement, only my reliability. That realization settled heavily in me. I watched how often he spoke without checking if I was listening, while I had spent years ensuring he was. I noticed how conversations ended without closure, without acknowledgement. I began to see how asymmetrical our communication had become, and instead of correcting it, I observed. There's a particular kind of power in observation when you're no longer trying to influence the outcome. I wasn't collecting grievances. I wasn't building a case. I was simply paying attention without interference. He mistook my silence for contentment. That's a common mistake. When someone has always made themselves small, their stillness reads as stability. He assumed everything was fine because I wasn't expressing dissatisfaction. He didn't notice that I had stopped expressing much of anything. In conversations with others, I spoke less about my marriage, not out of secrecy, but because there was less to say. It had become emotionally uneventful, predictable, flat. I redirected my energy elsewhere, into my work, into long walks, into reading, into my own thoughts. I started enjoying my solitude in a way I hadn't before, not as a refuge from conflict, but as a place of restoration. And something unexpected happened. The less I reached for him, the more clearly I saw myself. I noticed how steady I was without external validation, how calm I felt when I wasn't anticipating disappointment, how grounded my decisions became when they weren't filtered through someone else's attention span. He, on the other hand, remained the same, and that contrast became impossible to ignore. There were moments when he sensed a distance. He'd ask casually, "Everything okay?" And I'd answer honestly, "Yes." Because at that point, it was. I wasn't in crisis. I wasn't distressed. I was resolved. Silence gave me room to think, to plan, not in secretive ways, but in honest ones. I began to consider what kind of life I wanted if I stopped accommodating disregard. I asked myself what dignity looked like in action, not theory. I didn't rush toward a conclusion. Silence doesn't need urgency. It needs intention. Others might have interpreted my quiet as weakness, as resignation, as acceptance. But silence, when chosen, sharpens perception. It strips away illusion. I wasn't waiting for him to change. I was watching to see if he ever noticed. What no one noticed during that period, what they still don't fully understand, is that my quiet had direction. While everything appeared unchanged on the surface, I was paying attention with a level of precision I'd never allowed myself before. When you stop filling space emotionally, you gain time. Time to think, time to observe, time to document reality as it is, not as you hope it to be. I began noticing patterns with a clarity that surprised me, not just in my marriage, but in how people interacted with me in general. Who reached out first, who followed through, who remembered things without being reminded, who only showed up when it was convenient. This wasn't bitterness, it was data. At home, I noticed how often my husband defaulted to my competence. Bills continued to get paid. Schedules continued to run smoothly. Meals appeared, the house functioned. And because nothing broke, nothing was questioned. He didn't notice that I'd stopped sharing my inner life. He didn't notice that I no longer told him when something weighed on me. He didn't notice that my laughter had become polite instead of spontaneous. What he did notice, when it suited him, was that I was still there. And that was enough for him. I began quietly organizing my life, not dramatically, practically. I reviewed our finances, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I needed to understand my own position clearly. I made sure my accounts were accessible. I updated passwords. I confirmed what was in my name and what wasn't. I didn't hide this. I simply didn't announce it. I started keeping a private journal, not to vent, but to record. Dates, moments, patterns, not accusations, observations. Writing things down stripped them of emotional distortion. It allowed me to see continuity where I'd previously seen isolated incidents. I also paid attention to my own responses. When I felt the urge to explain myself, I paused. When I wanted to soften a boundary, I asked why. When I considered staying quiet, I made sure it was a choice, not a reflex. Externally, I remained composed. Internally, I was repositioning. I took on a new project at work that expanded my visibility and autonomy. I didn't do it to escape my marriage. I did it because I realized how much of myself I had sidelined. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be fully engaged, fully seen, on my own terms. The contrast was striking. In professional spaces, my attention was valued. My words were acknowledged. My input mattered. The difference wasn't my personality. It was the environment. That realization was sobering. At home, nothing changed. And that lack of change spoke louder than any argument could have. My husband continued as before. Phone in hand, attention fragmented, assumptions intact. He didn't ask deeper questions. He didn't notice the subtle shifts because they didn't inconvenience him. People rarely notice what doesn't demand their attention. Friends continued to see us as stable, no drama, no visible strain. And because I didn't confide in them, there was no narrative to challenge their assumptions. That was intentional. I wasn't preparing a performance. I was preparing myself. There's a misconception that preparation for change must look restless or secretive. In reality, it often looks like calm alignment. I wasn't rushing toward an exit. I was making sure that if I chose one, it would be grounded, not reactive. I thought carefully about what I wanted, not what I was afraid of losing. I considered what staying meant. What would leaving require? What dignity looked like in both scenarios? And the more I observed, the clearer it became. Nothing was shifting because nothing was being asked to shift. He was comfortable. I was capable. The system worked, just not for me. And that's the thing they never noticed. My quiet wasn't passive. It was preparatory. I was no longer waiting for permission to be prioritized. I was determining whether I wanted to continue participating in a dynamic that required my disappearance. By the time anyone might have sensed something was off, the decision-making was already well underway. Silence had given me a vantage point, and from that vantage point, the truth was undeniable. The private reveal didn't arrive with shock. There was no spike of adrenaline, no racing thoughts, no cinematic pause where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, almost gently, like the final piece clicking into a puzzle I had already been assembling for months. I was alone when it happened. That feels important to say. It was a Saturday morning. The house was still. My husband had stepped out to run errands, phone in hand as usual. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, a cup of coffee cooling beside me. I wasn't searching for evidence. I wasn't looking for confirmation of wrongdoing. I was reviewing documents, financial records, shared accounts, things I had already seen before but never really looked at. And then I saw it clearly. Not a betrayal in the traditional sense. No affair, no secret life, nothing scandalous enough to justify outrage. What I saw was something far more revealing, the full extent of how self-contained his world had become, and how peripheral I was to it. The financial patterns were telling, not because they were irresponsible, but because they reflected autonomy without consultation. Subscriptions I didn't know about. Purchases made casually, without discussion. Not hidden, just assumed acceptable. Decisions made with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't expect to be questioned. I realized then that the emotional dynamic I'd been living in had a practical mirror. He didn't just move through conversations without me. He made life decisions the same way, and I had allowed it by being competent, accommodating, and silent. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I understood in that moment that I wasn't being actively excluded. I was being unconsiderate, and there is a crucial difference. Exclusion implies awareness. This was an absence by default. The reveal wasn't about him. It was about me. I saw how thoroughly I had removed myself from the center of my own life. How often I'd chosen ease over truth. How deeply I'd internalized the belief that asking for attention was asking for too much. Sitting there, I didn't feel dramatic resolve. I felt grounded, almost relieved, because once you see reality clearly, you're no longer confused. You may still be sad. You may still hesitate, but you're no longer uncertain. I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a while. Let the understanding settle. This wasn't a problem to fix. It was a condition to acknowledge. I thought about the anniversary dinner coming up, the reservation I'd made, the care I'd already put into planning something meaningful. and for the first time I didn't frame it as an opportunity to reconnect. I saw it as a moment of truth, not a test, not a trap, just a mirror. If he showed up fully, I would notice. If he didn't, I would notice that too. And either way, I would stop translating the outcome into self-blame. That was the private reveal. I no longer needed proof of harm to justify change. The absence of presence was enough. I realized I had leverage, not over him, but over my own life. Financial independence, emotional regulation, the ability to walk away without chaos. I had built a life sturdy enough to stand without being propped up by someone else's attention. And perhaps the most sobering part was this. He had no idea. He believed the quiet meant contentment. The lack of conflict meant stability, that my steadiness signaled satisfaction. He didn't know that my clarity had already arrived. When he came home later that day, nothing in my behavior betrayed what I now understood. I asked about his errands. I listened. I nodded. I was calm. But underneath that calm was a settled knowing. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was deciding what I would do when it didn't. That knowledge didn't make me cold. It made me honest. And honesty, once fully internalized, doesn't demand immediate action. It simply removes illusion. By the time the anniversary dinner arrived, the reveal had already done its work. The rest would just confirm what I already knew. The decision point didn't come with urgency. There was no countdown, no internal ultimatum, no dramatic moment where I told myself, this is it. It arrived quietly, like most truths do when you stop resisting them. By the time our anniversary dinner approached, I already knew that I wasn't going there to fix anything. I wasn't hoping it would magically restore what had been missing. I wasn't bracing for disappointment either. I was simply attentive. That alone marked the difference. I got ready slowly that evening. Not in a performative way, but intentionally. I chose clothes that felt like me. Nothing symbolic, nothing strategic, just comfortable confidence. I looked at myself in the mirror and noticed something unexpected. I wasn't anxious. There was no tightness in my chest, no rehearsed speeches waiting to spill out. I felt present. At the restaurant, everything was pleasant on the surface. The lighting was warm. The table was set. We exchanged polite smiles. He seemed relaxed, casual, familiar. He reached for his phone almost immediately. I noticed it without reacting. Throughout the dinner, the pattern unfolded exactly as it always had. He scrolled. He glanced up occasionally. He asked questions that arrived late, after moments had already passed. I answered calmly. I didn't rush. I didn't shorten myself. I didn't perform. And I felt something settle. This was the moment I had already prepared for. Not because it was painful, but because it was clarifying. At one point, I stopped speaking mid-thought. Not out of frustration, out of recognition. He didn't notice right away. When he did, he asked me to continue. And I did, but without urgency, without need. That's when I knew. Not in a cinematic sense, in a grounded one. I had options. I could bring it up, ask for change, suggest counseling, demand attention. Any of those paths was available to me, and I considered them seriously. But I also considered the cost. I asked myself whether I wanted to teach someone how to value my presence, or whether I wanted to stop participating in a dynamic that required instruction. That question answered itself. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was guided by alignment. I didn't want to be managed, monitored, or intermittently noticed. I wanted to be engaged with, or not at all. When the check arrived, I reached for it calmly and paid. He looked up, surprised, but said nothing. I stood up. He asked where I was going. I'm heading home, I said. My voice was even. No accusation, no explanation. I walked out, not to make a point, not to punish, but because the decision had already been made internally, my body simply followed. Outside, the air felt cool and grounding. I stood there for a moment, not in triumph, not in grief, just in presence. That was the decision point, not the walking out, but the moment I realized I didn't need to negotiate my dignity. I didn't block him. I didn't disappear dramatically. I went home. I slept. I lived. But something was now irreversible. Not because of what I did publicly, but because of what I had decided privately. I had chosen not to explain myself in relevance, and once that choice is made, there is no going back. After that night, there was no announcement, no declaration of what I'd done or what it meant. I didn't label the moment. I didn't frame it as a turning point. I simply continued, quietly, deliberately, on a different path. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means not performing your decisions for validation. The days that followed were calm on the surface. I went to work. I handled responsibilities. I spoke when spoken to. I wasn't cold, but I was no longer accommodating. The emotional surplus I used to offer, anticipation, reassurance, explanation, was gone. My husband was confused, not alarmed. He sensed a change but couldn't locate it. He asked a few casual questions. "You okay?" "You seem tired," I answered truthfully and briefly. There was nothing to argue with. Behind that calm exterior, I was taking practical steps. I scheduled appointments, not secretly, privately. A consultation with a lawyer to understand my options. A meeting with a financial advisor to confirm what I already suspected. I was more stable than I'd been led to believe. These weren't acts of aggression. They were acts of clarity. I gathered documents, made copies, organized records. I did it methodically, the way I approached everything else in my life. There was no rush because urgency would have introduced emotion, and emotion would have clouded judgment. He didn't notice. That's the part people find hardest to understand later. They imagine some dramatic shift, some obvious warning sign. But when someone has been emotionally absent for a long time, they don't recognize distance. They're accustomed to it. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I simply stopped initiating. I stopped smoothing over discomfort. I stopped reminding him of things that mattered to me. The absence of effort went unnoticed because effort had never been acknowledged. At work, my focus sharpened. I took on more responsibility, not to distract myself, but because I was finally directing my energy towards something that reciprocated. The contrast between being heard professionally and being overlooked personally became undeniable. I didn't confide in friends, not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't seeking consensus. I wasn't building a narrative. I was making a decision. There's a misconception that silence is passive. In reality, silence can be deeply active. It allows you to move without interference, to make choices without defending them in advance. At home, routines continued. We shared space. We spoke about logistics, weather, schedules, nothing emotionally loaded. It wasn't hostile, it was neutral. And neutrality, after years of imbalance, can feel like withdrawal to the person who benefited from your emotional labor. He began trying in small ways, not enough to change the pattern, but enough to reassure himself. A comment here, a gesture there, and I noticed them without reacting. Not because I was punishing him, but because I was watching for consistency, not effort. Consistency never arrived. By the time he began to feel something slipping, it was already gone. The version of me who waited, who explained, who hoped, that woman had quietly exited. I didn't announce her departure. I simply stopped acting in ways that kept her alive. Moving in silence meant I didn't need agreement to proceed. I didn't need him to understand yet. Understanding often comes later, sometimes too late. For now, clarity was enough, and clarity moves quietly. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, unevenly, in ways that were easy to misinterpret. At first, they looked like inconveniences, small disruptions, moments of discomfort that couldn't quite be traced back to a cause. My husband began to feel something was off, but he couldn't name it. The household still ran smoothly. I still handled what I'd always handled. But the emotional cushioning, the part of me that anticipated his needs, softened his stress, absorbed his inattention, was gone. And without that buffer, things began to feel sharper for him. He noticed silence more, not because there was more of it, but because it was no longer filled for him. Conversations ended sooner. Pauses stretched longer. When he spoke, I listened, but I didn't chase the connection afterward. I didn't extend the moment. I let it stand on its own. He began repeating himself, as if checking whether I was still there. I was, but differently. There were moments when he seemed unsettled. He'd ask if something was wrong, then move on quickly when I said no. The discomfort didn't linger long enough for him to confront it fully. That's how consequences often work at first. They're subtle enough to be dismissed. But subtle doesn't mean insignificant. He started missing things. Appointments he assumed I'd remind him of. Details I used to manage without comment. When those things slipped, He looked surprised, not at the situation, but at me, as if waiting for me to step in and fix it. I didn't, not out of spite, out of accuracy. Those things had never been my responsibility. They'd just quietly become mine. The loss he was beginning to feel wasn't of me as a person. It was the system I had built around him, the ease, the continuity, the emotional scaffolding. And because that loss didn't come with an explanation, it was confusing. He tried to reassert normalcy, suggested plans, initiated conversations. These attempts were sporadic and inconsistent. They felt more like course correction than engagement. And I noticed that he still defaulted to his phone when moments slowed. That detail mattered. It told me the core dynamic hadn't shifted. Only his awareness of comfort had. Friends began to sense something too. Not because I said anything, but because my availability changed. I declined invitations more selectively. I stopped over-explaining my absence. When asked how things were, I answered simply, "Fine." And for the first time, that answer was true. There's a strange calm that comes with no longer trying to manage how others feel. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel guilty. I felt settled. Meanwhile, the consequences continued to accumulate. He grew restless, less certain. He checked in more often, but without depth. The questions were there, but the attention was still fractured. And that's when I understood something important. Awareness alone doesn't create change. Discomfort doesn't automatically lead to growth. Sometimes it just leads to confusion. He was feeling the absence of what I used to provide, but he hadn't yet connected that absence to his own behavior. And without that connection, his responses stayed superficial. I watched without commentary, because consequences don't need narration. They speak through experience, and his experience was shifting. By the time he realized something was genuinely wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the conversation he wanted to have now was one I'd been having internally for years. The change in him was gradual but noticeable. His attempts at connection became more frequent, less casual. He put his phone down more often, noticeably, intentionally. He asked how my day was and waited for the answer. He suggested we do things together again, the way we used to. From the outside, it might have looked like an improvement. From where I stood, it felt late. Not because the gestures were unwelcome, but because they were reactive. They didn't come from a new understanding. They came from discomfort, from the sense that something essential was slipping out of reach. There's a difference between presence offered freely and presence deployed to prevent loss. I didn't dismiss his efforts. I acknowledged them calmly. I participated when it felt natural. But I didn't reattach myself to hope. Hope had been quietly retired. He began asking more direct questions. Are you happy? Did I do something? These questions carried a subtle panic, even when spoken gently. And that panic mattered, not because it was wrong, but because it revealed the timing. He was responding to the consequences, not the cause. When I answered, I was honest without being exhaustive. I didn't unload years of stored grievances. I didn't recount every moment of inattention. I said what was true now. I don't feel connected, I said once, calmly, simply. He looked startled, as if the words hadn't occurred to him. He apologized, said he'd try harder, said he hadn't realized. And I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. I believed he hadn't realized, that he hadn't intended harm, that he'd assumed I was fine because I always had been. But understanding someone's intentions doesn't undo their impact, and it doesn't obligate you to stay. By then, my clarity was complete. I had already accepted the shape of the relationship as it truly was. And once you accept reality, effort aimed at restoring illusion feels hollow. He suggested counseling. I listened. I considered it. Not dismissively, but honestly. What would we be fixing? The issue wasn't communication. It was evaluation. I didn't want to be taught how to ask for attention. I didn't want to negotiate my relevance. I wanted to be in a relationship where presence was natural, not prompted by fear. That's not something you fix once it's gone. I could see the regret forming in him. Not just for what he'd done, but for what he hadn't noticed. The missed moments, the accumulated absence, the way he'd assumed stability without tending to it. Regret has a particular texture. It's heavy, but it doesn't move forward easily. And I felt compassion, real compassion. But compassion isn't the same as return. I didn't feel angry, I felt finished. That's the part people struggle to understand. They imagine heartbreak or rage at this stage. But what I felt was closure, without ceremony. The efforts came because the risk became visible. And by then, my decision wasn't about risk anymore. It was about truth. We talked more in those weeks than we had in months. But the conversations were retrospective, analytical, too focused on repair, not presence. The connection he was reaching for was already something I'd mourned. And you can't revive what's already been grieved. By the time he wanted to fix it, I had already let it go. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was nothing like people imagine. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown back and forth, no emotional eruption that left either of us breathless. It was calm, measured, almost quiet. And that quiet carried more weight than anger ever could. We sat at the dining table one evening, the same table where I'd once sorted mail and felt something shift inside me. The symmetry wasn't intentional, but it felt fitting. He looked tense, not defensive, uncertain, as if he sensed that this conversation would not be negotiable. He spoke first. He apologized again, said he'd been distracted, said he hadn't realized how distant he'd become, said he wanted to fix things. I listened, fully, without interruption. When he finished, there was a pause. Not an awkward one, a complete one. I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't soften what came next. I believe you, I said. I believe you didn't mean to hurt me. Relief crossed his face. But intent isn't the issue, I continued. Impact is. That was the line where the conversation changed shape. I explained, not emotionally, but clearly, how it had felt to slowly disappear in my own relationship. How being consistently deprioritized had taught me to make myself smaller. How I'd adapted until there was almost nothing left to adapt. I didn't list incidents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to convince him of my pain. I described my experience as a fact. He listened, this time without his phone in his hand. When I told him I had walked out of the anniversary dinner not to punish him, but because I'd already made a decision about myself, he looked stunned. Not angry, not defensive, just stunned. You didn't tell me, he said quietly. I showed you, I replied. Over a long time. That was the moment he understood it wasn't about that night. It was about the years before it. He asked if there was anything he could do now. I paused before answering, not for effect, but to be honest. No, I said, not because you're incapable, because I'm done asking. The words landed gently, but they were final. I told him I didn't want to spend the rest of my life teaching someone how to be present with me. That I wanted a partnership, not negotiation. That I needed a relationship where my presence was assumed to matter. He asked if I still loved him. I care about you, I said, and that was true. But I don't feel connected anymore. Connection isn't restored by apology alone. It's built by consistency over time. And time was the one thing I was no longer willing to invest. The confrontation ended the way it began, quietly. No slammed doors, no dramatic exits, just two people sitting with the truth. Later alone, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. I hadn't minimized myself. I hadn't explained away my decision. I hadn't exploded or withdrawn. I had simply stated what was true, and that was enough. Who I am now isn't defined by what I left behind. That feels important to say. I didn't rebuild myself in opposition to my marriage or in reaction to loss. I didn't emerge hardened or resentful. I emerged clarified. For a long time, I thought strength meant endurance, staying calm, absorbing discomfort without complaint, being the person others could rely on because I never asked to be held in return. I mistook emotional self-sufficiency for self-respect. Now I understand the difference. Self-respect isn't about how much you can tolerate. It's about how accurately you respond. Today my life is quieter in a different way. There's less background noise, less monitoring, less adjusting, less emotional translation. I speak when I have something to say. I pause when I don't. I no longer rush to fill the silence to keep others comfortable. And the people who remain in my life have adapted to that version of me, or they've drifted away. Both outcomes feel honest. I've learned that presence isn't something you earn by being agreeable. It's something you require by being aligned. When I stopped performing steadiness, I discovered how grounded I already was. I still value calm. I still value reflection. But I no longer confuse quiet with invisibility. If I'm in the room, I expect to be considered. If I'm not, I'm willing to leave the room. That boundary isn't aggressive, it's clean. I don't replay the past with bitterness. I see it as information. It was a period where I learned, slowly and thoroughly, what happens when you prioritize harmony over truth. I don't regret the care I gave, but I no longer offer it indiscriminately. In my work, I'm more direct. I no longer over-explain my ideas. I state them and let them land. The confidence that grew from reclaiming my personal boundaries carried into every area of my life. In relationships, I notice attentiveness now. Not grand gestures, small consistencies, listening without being prompted, remembering without reminders, presence that doesn't compete with distraction. I don't demand perfection. I require effort that's freely given. What surprised me most was that I didn't become colder. I became more generous with myself. I laugh more easily. I enjoy my own company. I feel less anxious because I'm no longer waiting to be noticed. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you'll respond appropriately if something feels off, that you won't explain yourself into discomfort or stay silent to preserve appearances. I don't measure my worth by how useful I am anymore. And perhaps the most profound change is this: I trust my perceptions. If something feels misaligned, I don't rush to rationalize it away. I pay attention, because the version of me who ignored those signals is gone. Who I am now is not louder, not harsher, just clearer. And clarity, once claimed, doesn't need defending. There's a quiet lesson in this story, and it has nothing to do with walking out of a restaurant or ending a marriage. Those are just visible moments. The real shift happens long before anyone else can see it. Disrespect rarely arrives as cruelty. More often, it arrives as an omission, as a distraction, being half present in places where full presence is implied. And because those moments are small, we talk ourselves out of reacting to them. We tell ourselves we're being mature, understanding, flexible. But flexibility, when it's one-sided, becomes erasure. What I learned is this: you don't need a dramatic reason to leave something that no longer honors you. You don't need proof of betrayal. You don't need to justify your clarity with catastrophe. Sometimes, knowing you're no longer being considered is enough. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authority over yourself. It's the decision to stop negotiating your dignity in rooms where your presence is optional. I didn't win anything by leaving. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't emerge triumphant. What I gained was alignment, the relief of no longer acting against my own awareness. If there's a moral here, it's not leave sooner or demand more. It's this: pay attention to the small moments, the interruptions, the divided attention, the way your voice trails off when no one notices. Those moments are data. And when you stop explaining them away, they tell you everything you need to know. You are allowed to choose yourself without announcing it. You are allowed to walk away calmly. You are allowed to stop offering depth where there is no capacity to receive it. And most importantly, you're allowed to trust the version of you that sees clearly, even if that clarity arrives quietly. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to ask you something, not for debate, but for reflection. Have you ever noticed a moment that seemed small at the time, but later realized it was the beginning of the end? If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. Sometimes, naming the moment is the first step toward reclaiming yourself.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.